Good evening and welcome to the Mansfield Dialogues. My name is Dina Mansour. I'm the Executive Director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center, and it's our honor to have you join us tonight. This event is live on Zoom and Facebook through both the Mansfield Center and Missoula Community Access Television. This event will be videotaped by Missoula Community Access Television as part of its Media Assistance Grant Program to nonprofit organizations and available for future viewing. This will also be recorded and posted on the Mansfield Center website and available on our Facebook page. We had more than 270 people register for this evening's program. There's obviously a lot of interest in what our speakers have to say tonight. Some of you may be new to Zoom, so forgive me for going over a few ground rules. We ask that you keep your sound muted throughout the dialogue. To have your screen show only the speaker, go to the top right corner of your screen and ensure that you are set to speaker view rather than gallery view. We hope that tonight truly meets the definition of dialogue in the best way possible in an electronic format through the chat box. So if you go down to the chat box, we ask that you input your questions and your comments throughout, and our moderator will be pulling questions at the end of the presentation. So I'm honored to introduce one of this evening's speakers, Ms. Bay Fang. She was until recently president of Radio Free Asia, where she oversaw award-winning journalism with the mission of bringing free press to closed societies in Asia. A former Beijing bureau chief for US News and World Report, who also covered the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, she has the added perspective of having served in government under the Obama administration as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Press and Public Diplomacy. Ms. Fang earned her undergraduate degree at Harvard University, was a visiting fellow at Oxford University, and a Fulbright Scholar in Hong Kong. She has very unique skills, having trained as a French chef at Le Cordon Bleu in Paris, and she also holds a brown belt in Kung Fu. Bay, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you to everyone who's tuning in tonight for this talk. I'm thrilled to be here. So Tiff and I have actually known each other since the late 1990s, when we were both based in China as journalists. He was the well-established Business Week correspondent, and I was the young upstart who had just started working for US News and World Report. His experience definitely showed then as we covered a time that was pivotal to US-China relations, beginning with the presidential visit by then President Clinton in June of 1998, to the mistaken bombing of China's embassy in Belgrade by a US bomber, which led to days of protests outside the US embassy in Beijing, through to the collision of an American spy plane and a PLA fighter jet over Hainan Island in April 2001. And finally, China's entry into the World Trade Organization in December 2001. All in all, he has spent 2 decades working in China, is obviously fluent in Mandarin. He's reported from all of China's provinces and regions, including Tibet and Xinjiang, covering the rise of companies and entrepreneurs, manufacturing and migrants, demography, and civil society. He's also reported from North Korea, Mongolia, and Cambodia on China's growing economic and political influence. Most recently, as you can tell from his fascinating book, he's looked more closely at how China's policies, such as its household registration system, are leading to growing inequality and social tension and are holding back the country's development. With that, I'll turn it over to Tiff to tell you all about his book.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Bay. I'm going to go ahead and start by trying to share a screen here. And let's see here before I get this going. Here we go. Yeah, I would like to start to talk a little bit about the origins of my book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. And in order to do so, you have to go all the way back to the year 2000, shortly after I'd met Bay. So in the year 2000, I'd been in China for 5 years at that point. I'd come in beginning of 95. And I'd been focusing a lot of my reporting on the run-up to China's entry into the World Trade Organization, also on sort of a new booming tech sector in the cities of the big cities of China, which clearly was an important thing. There was China's first internet boom happening. There was the new phenomena of returnee Chinese who'd been educated overseas in the US and other countries that were coming back to start their own companies, often internet companies. So that's sort of what I'd been focusing on. But that year, my reporting sort of took a shift in a different direction. In the year 2000, I worked on 2 cover stories for Business Week magazine, both of which took me down to, for the first time, to a rather remote rural southwestern province called Guizhou, which then, and unfortunately even today, still today, is also quite poor, one of the poorest provinces when you look at per capita income in China. And the first of those covers that I worked on right here was called China's Wealth Gap. And at this point in China, the year 2000, as I said, the leadership of China, President Jiang Zemin then, was becoming increasingly concerned about the fact that there was a growing gap between the coastal areas of China and the interior provinces like Guizhou. And President Jiang launched a policy called Develop the West, which was an effort to try to narrow that gap between the coasts and the interior of China. Second cover story that also took me back to this province of Guizhou was on the migrant workers of China. Already several hundred million strong. These were the young people that were leaving the poorer interior regions of China, traveling to the coasts, then mainly to work in export factories or on construction sites. And so I went, as I said, I went back to Guizhou, visited a village, a particular village called Binghua Cun or Binghua Village in Guizhou province. And also during that same trip, went to the Pearl River Delta, the factory zone of China then and now, and met some of these same young migrant workers. So they were from the village of Binghua Cun and were working in factories in a city called Dongguan on the Pearl River up from Hong Kong. This picture here on the cover image is a young man, then a young man named Mo Rubo, who I got to know very well then, and then in the intervening, in the following years as well. So again, my book really focuses on these 2 parts of China. On the right here is a more recent picture of that same village, Binghua Cun in Guizhou. And on the left there is a typical factory picture. That's workers between shifts at an SUV factory in Guangzhou. So in the Pearl River Delta, Guangzhou, the capital of Guangdong. And the young man who was who was pictured on that cover, Mo Rubo, here's a picture of him then in 2000 when I first met him. He, at that point, I think was 21. He had already left his village of Binghua Cun for probably 5 years. He'd left when he dropped out of school and become a migrant. And he had worked in a couple different places around China, in Shanghai, in Ningbo, large coastal city near Shanghai, and then in a number of different cities in Guangdong before he ended up working, as you can see here, as a welder in a Taiwanese-owned electronic components manufacturer in Dongguan. A couple more pictures here. This is the same young guy, Mo Rubo, and his then girlfriend. She was also a migrant worker, but from a different part of China. Another quite poor province, Henan, but in the northern part of the country. So actually what I did was I first had met these workers in their factories where they were working in Dongguan, and then a few months later in Dongguan, Guangdong, and then a few months later had gone and visited their village of Binghua Cun. And this young woman in the red vest here Mo Mei Chen. I had met her in Dongguan. A couple months later, went back and I went to Binghua Sun. She was back then for two reasons, really. One was to help her parents with the rice harvest. The village, Binghua Sun, was mainly reliant on subsistence rice agriculture. And so she was back helping them with that. But the other main reason she had gone back was to renew her identity card. And this was very, very important for all migrants then. At that point, the migrants were particularly vulnerable when they would go and work in these factory towns. And one of the things that could happen to them is getting picked up by the local police for not having all the proper identity cards or having an expired identity card. And this had actually happened to one of her cousins. And basically the police would hold them for ransom, tell them to pay a very large fine, which would in many cases be several months salary for these migrants. And they would be held until they gathered the money, or their friends and family got the money together and bailed them out. So this had happened to her cousin, and she had gone back to make sure that she would not face a similar fate. She wasn't going to stay in Dongguan as long as her identity card was expired. So as Bay mentioned, one of the very crucial moments of that era in China, and indeed of the whole modern era in China, was its entry into the World Trade Organization, which came a little over a year later, a year after I had visited Guizhou in 2001. When I actually visited Guizhou and visited this village of Binghua Sun, people in China already knew that China was going to enter the WTO. I think in late 1999, the US and China had signed a bilateral accession agreement for China to enter the WTO. And that was one of the key bilateral accession agreements that China had to sign in order to eventually enter the World Trade Organization. So everybody knew that it was going to happen in late 2001. And actually, when I visited the village, I remember a conversation with the party secretary, or the village party chief, and he knew all about WTO. And one of the reasons that he actually was willing to talk to me was he was hopeful that getting written about in an American business magazine actually might bring investment into his little remote village. And particularly what he was interested in was getting investment for a vegetable processing factory. So they wouldn't have to just rely on the subsistence agriculture, but they could process their crops and actually make more money. So WTO has a tremendous impact across the board in China. As I say in this slide, tens of thousands of new coastal export factories are opened. Millions and millions, tens of millions of more migrant workers come from the Chinese countryside. Foreign investment in China jumps from $47 billion in 2001 to $124 billion a decade later. This is a slide of infrastructure. One of the key things that had been part of this Develop the West program that I mentioned earlier, which President Zhang had launched, President Jiang Zemin, was a build out of infrastructure into the interior of China, with the idea that if they built the roads, the expressways, the high-speed rail, then economic progress would follow. So there was this tremendous expansion of infrastructure into the interior of China. Another picture of that. This is Guizhou as well. Typical landscape, very hilly, quite beautiful. And if you look here along this expressway, I think the billboard is a little too small to actually read the characters, but that large billboard that you can see in the picture, the fact that it is red and gold is a very good hint that this is Communist Party propaganda. And I believe this was perhaps a slogan of now President and Party Secretary Xi Jinping. So not only did they build out infrastructure throughout the country, they also have pushed propaganda throughout the country as well, including to remote places like Guizhou and even into the village of Binghua Sun. So fast forward until today, there's been this undeniable progress, tremendous accomplishment in raising living standards throughout China. Next year is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, which was founded in 1921. So the government under Xi Jinping has set some centenary goals, 100-year goals that they want to accomplish. And again, for the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party, coming right up at the end of this year, they have pledged to eliminate absolute poverty throughout the country. And it looks like they are, according to their definition, they will eliminate absolute poverty throughout the country. Other goals that they set were to double the size of the GDP for the country and double it between 2010 and 2020. And they have already done that, so they have accomplished that. And a third goal was to double disposable per capita income, again, between 2000 and 2020. And it looks like they will actually accomplish that as well, which is, again, undeniably a tremendous economic achievement and also a very good social achievement for the people of China. But there's another statistic I just want to highlight, which I think says a lot about the challenges that China still faces today. And that is, so when I was first visiting Guizhou and writing about the income gap in this Develop the West program, one of the statistics that people always brought up, officials would bring up, was that the gap between urban and rural incomes was about 3 to 1. So your average person in the cities in China was making about 3 times as much as people in the countryside. Well, that gap is almost the same. It's barely changed at all. It's still about, it's 2.7 to 1 or something. So they have not succeeded at all in narrowing that gap, which they pledged to do 20 years ago. Probably much more alarmingly, China has a deeply unequal economy and society today. It has a wealth gap that's actually on par with that of Russia, which is not something that I think a lot of people realize. Thomas Piketty, the noted inequality scholar, has actually done survey work in China and found that the wealth gap is roughly the same as Russia, and probably even of more concern, it's growing as quickly as it's growing in Russia, which is very, very fast. So, so the question that I try to answer in my book is why, after all these years and of trying to narrow this wealth gap in China, why is it still very much alive and a problem and a challenge for China's future economic development? And in my book, I really focus in on 2 legacy policies. These are policies that actually date back to the Mao Zedong era, to the 1950s, and they're still very much in force in China today. And the one I really spend a lot of time looking at, which I think more than anything else explains why this wealth gap is still there and why the people from the countryside and the migrants still really lag behind the people in the cities, is this thing here called the household registration, or the household registration policy. And the household registration, also known as the hukou in Chinese, is basically a policy that back in the Mao era was one that actually restricted the ability of people to move freely from the countryside to the cities. Back then, of course, most of the rural people were working in communes, and Mao put this policy in place in part to just have basically to ensure that China would have low-cost agricultural goods to supply to people in the cities who would be working on industrializing the nation. So he put this policy in place. So today, obviously, it no longer restricts people's migration. We now have probably 300 million domestic migrants in China traveling around. So they very much do travel around. But what the household registration still does today is it ties the social welfare benefits of every Chinese person to the place where they were born, or more specifically to where their parents were born. And what it in effect means for migrant workers today in China is that they are, in most cases, unable to get the same kind of, the same degree of quality medical care that people in the cities get, and also that their children, the children of the migrant workers, are in most cases are not able to go to the public schools in the cities, which also happen to be far, far better than the public schools in the countryside. It's also created this basically human rights tragedy in China today, which is what the Chinese call the phenomena of left behind children, which is, depending on who you talk to, 60 to 100 million children of migrant workers who, because they are unable to go to school in the cities where their migrant parents work, end up staying back in the countryside. Typically will only see their parents once a year when their parents come back for the Lunar New Year. And increasingly in recent years are housed and educated in these very large, rather impersonal boarding schools in the countryside. And I had the opportunity to visit a bunch of these boarding schools. Often the facilities would actually look fairly good. The government, to its credit, has tried to pump money into building better schools, but the education typically is not very good at all. And it's just a lot of terrible problems associated with the fact that these kids end up being far from their parents and grow up in these very impersonal boarding schools. Both health issues, malnutrition is common, and also, as you might imagine, unfortunately, psychological problems as well. And the other big legacy policy I talk about in my book is what they call the dual land system. And the dual land system, in effect, means that whereas in the cities of China, we've seen this explosion of wealth as urban people buy and sell their apartments and create, probably the biggest real estate boom the world has ever seen in the major cities of China. This is not matched at all in the countryside. Because of this Mao era policy, the rural land that Chinese farmers have, and migrant workers typically would have as well, they would have a plot of land back in the countryside, cannot be monetized or sold. So what happens is you've got a situation where in the cities there's an explosion of wealth, growing incomes and growing wealth based on the selling of apartments. This has not happened at all in the countryside. And again, this dual land system is behind, probably more than anything else, is behind this growing wealth gap in China today. The way the dual land system works, by the way, is although the farmers themselves or the migrants are unable to monetize, or in most cases sell or rent the land at market prices, somebody else is. So that doesn't mean that no one is benefiting from the rural land. What happens is the township governments and the village governments, the officials are actually able to, in effect, redistrict the land from agricultural use to commercial or industrial use, residential use, and then sell it on to property developers. Typically, they would buy the land at a very nominal price from the farmers and then turn around and sell it at many, many multiples higher and make a lot of money. So one last slide here. This is one of my last visits. This is Mo Rubo, the young guy who was the welder shown in the earlier slide. And this is his wife now. It was his girlfriend, the migrant worker from Henan in the earlier slide as well. And he, unlike many migrants, has decided to tough it out and try to make a life in the cities. He is actually living and has a small business with his wife. They source athletic. They have their own athletic apparel brand, not a brand that none of us would ever heard of, and even your average Beijing person or Shanghai wouldn't know about as well. But they source this brand from factories, and they try to sell their goods online. They run it out of a small apartment that they rent, which is their home and their office, and struggling to get by. As I said, a lot of other migrants aren't toughing it out in the cities. What they've done is there's been a big reverse migration with a lot of migrants going back to the countryside to try to reinvent themselves, particularly as factory jobs have started to dry up for migrant workers. On this visit, when I met Mo Rubo and his wife, here's their daughter. She was 6 years old. They were struggling with the decision of where to put her in school. Mo Rubo was adamant that she would not become a left behind child. He did not want her to go back and be away from the family and study back in the village or the township where he was from in Guizhou. And so really the only other option, because she's not eligible to go to public schools in the cities, was to put her in one of these private schools that have popped up to cater to the children of migrant workers. And these schools are not usually not only not of very good quality, but they are actually quite expensive. And so he was struggling with trying to figure out how they could keep her with them in the city of Dongguan, and also find a way to pay for her tuition in this not very good school. So let me stop now and hand this back to Bay, and we can get to the much more interesting part, which is our conversation and questions from the audience.
Thank you much. That was really fascinating, as I knew it would be. I wanted to start out by looking a bit at present day as you end your book. So one of the predictions that you make is that discontent among these have-nots in China may spur a movement that would possibly topple China's one-party rule, or at least bring about significant political change. So I'm just thinking back to when we were there, and even in the late 90s, I remember journalists talking about a possible Beijing Spring and the idea that the future of the party was vulnerable to these protests that were flaring up around the country even back then. And it seems like every few years there is this discussion of, how vulnerable is the Chinese Communist Party. So that obviously has not happened as of yet, and the CCP seems stronger than ever under the leadership of Xi Jinping. Can you speak to to that history and why you believe that this moment may be different from all the others?
That's a very good question, Bay. Yeah, I don't know. So I wouldn't characterize my book as predicting that there will be any imminent revolution. And as all of us know, there's the world is littered with dire China predictions that have been proven wrong. Notable books like The Coming Collapse of China, which is, was published probably at least 15 years ago, predicting the imminent collapse of China. So I don't think I really make that prediction. The other thing I would note, which I think is very striking, is looking at China today after some initial concerns, very large concerns amongst the Chinese population about the Chinese government's handling of COVID-19 in the early days, not that long ago, but it seems like a long time ago in February, March, or January, February, March, when there was actually a cover-up by the Chinese government of the scale of the problem with COVID-19. What we've seen, of course, is a tremendous success by the Chinese government in dealing with the COVID crisis and now to the point where they've basically reopened society and their economy, and they are the only major economy expected to grow in this year, in 2020. And I think you see that success reflected in support for the Chinese Communist Party. And there was a survey recently, I think at UC San Diego, out of UC San Diego, that showed that there was a very high level of support for in Chinese cities for Xi Jinping, and particularly for the government or the party's handling of the COVID-19 crisis. So I think that's been a real victory for them. And by the way, it's even more so when they compare it to the disastrous handling of the COVID crisis here in the United States. Makes it very easy for them to point to their successes when we've done such a terrible, terrible job in dealing with it. So I would just make that point. I do think that for many years now, there's been this sort of implicit bargain between the Chinese Communist Party and the people of China, which basically says, we will guarantee ever rising living standards and rather rapid rising living standards for all of you, the Chinese people. And we will give that to you. And in exchange, you will not demand real civil rights. You will not, free speech is not allowed. You will not openly criticize the Chinese Communist Party. And this has been a bargain that has worked very, very well, I would argue, for the Chinese Communist Party for all these years. I do think that bargain has been one that has really most benefited urban Chinese. So if you look again at the growing wealth gap, you can see that this is not that the rising living standards are not benefiting everybody in China to the same degree. And I would argue that even before what we're seeing now in China, which is, although the economy is returning, it's clear that China is moving towards a much slower growth trajectory for a whole bunch of reasons. And it's quite clear that there is no possibility that China will be able to continue to grow its the living standards of its people to the degree that it has done in many years. So this is sort of the big picture. At the same time, we're seeing, as I talk about in my book, a much more alarming growth in this wealth gap, which again is sort of exacerbating already existing distinctions between the haves and the have-nots in China. And I think that whether or not it could actually lead to a movement that would challenge the Communist Party is an open question. The Chinese Communist Party has tremendous powers of repression, as we all know, and they've proven very effective at using them. And the other thing that I write about in my book, there was a labor movement in China which was very effective around 2010 to 2012. That has been almost completely obliterated by the policies of Xi Jinping. He's clamped down, thrown all the activists into jail, and basically stopped this nascent labor movement that was growing in China. So anyway, I guess what I would say is I'm not predicting revolution by any means, but I do think that given what we're going to see going forward with China and the continuing problems with the wealth gap, that the frustration with the system is going to become more and more of an issue.
Okay, that makes sense. So another question. So you mentioned China's handling of the COVID crisis. And since your book was published before the impact of the pandemic was widely felt throughout the world, I'm just wondering if you can speak to its effect on China's economy and its relationship to the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, well, it's had a real obvious impact on both of those, and China had already, for probably at least a decade, been talking about the fact that they need to transition their economy away from its sort of investment export-led model to one that is much more reliant on domestic spending or the spending of its own people. And they've been saying this again for probably a decade now. I would say that the COVID-19 crisis has really brought home to them the necessity of moving much more quickly to do this. I mean, we've seen world trade collapse with COVID. Before even COVID, we've seen the 2-year trade war with the US, an increasing, from China's perspective, an increasingly hostile world, particularly led by the United States when it comes to dealing with China. And so recently, Xi Jinping launched a new strategy, which has as usual, they always come up with a real mouthful of a slogan to talk about their policies. This is called the dual circulation strategy. That's what Xi Jinping decided to call it. And it's dual in a nod to the fact that they will continue to trade with the world. So they will still have an external focus. But the real emphasis of this policy is sort of moving much more quickly to try to become much more self-reliant, both on the spending power of their own people and also in terms of technology, trying to become much more reliant on their own technology. And that's the other side of the dual circulation strategy. So this is something that is now clearly a top priority for China. You can also see it in its relationship with the world. I mean, they already were feeling, as I said, as if the world was lined up against them. And now, you know, what they're saying basically is that's okay. We can manage on our own. It has basically got them to speed up all their efforts to try to develop indigenous technology. For example, semiconductors now. It's a big national priority. Huge amounts of money is going into trying to develop a indigenous semiconductor industry.
Interesting. So just one final question before we open it up to questions from the audience. So since we're on the cusp of a new administration in which China is seen to be the biggest foreign policy challenge, given the conclusions that you draw in your book about China's economic development and its expansionist approach to its neighbors, what would your advice be to the Biden administration on how to approach U.S.-China relations? I know it's an easy question.
Yeah, a little question. Yeah, so I mean, the answer is made easier by the fact that I think we've done so many things wrong for the last 4 years. So basically, just don't do that. So you know, this obsession, I would say, with doing everything unilaterally, not only, you know, pulling out of, whether it's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, out of the big trading agreements, you know, where does that get us? We just saw on Sunday, China became part of a 15-nation, I think they call it the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the world's largest trading agreement. And the US is, of course, not part of it. And that brings together Japan, China, Australia, New Zealand, and all the Southeast Asian nations as well. So part of it, I think, is to, I think the US government needs to take a much more sort of return to its traditional multilateral approach to dealing with China. I think that in confronting China's more mercantilist economic tendencies and its increasingly assertive diplomatic, they call it wolf warrior approach to dealing with the rest of the world, I think we would obviously be, I think it sort of goes without saying, we could be much more effective working with other countries and certainly not alienating some of our partners as has happened in the last 4 years. So I think that's one thing, having a much more multilateral approach to China. China is simply too strong, too large, too important to think that the US can somehow take it on all by themselves or have a relationship just built between the US and China. I don't think the world works that way. I guess I just stop there. I think that's the the most important thing. I guess I just say one more thing. Before the election, people kept out. I was asked a lot if I expected things to change in the relationship if Biden were to win. And now that he's won, I repeat the same message, which is, unfortunately, I'm skeptical that we're going to see, that the relationship would return to something like we saw in the past. And that is in large part because we only had an election and we're only having a change of leadership in one of these capitals. President Xi Jinping, not only does he not face an election, he's changed the Constitution so that he never has to step down. He's done away with term limits. And, they set a goal, they've set a new, when they just announced their latest 5-year target, they also, for the first time, set a target for 2032. And people were calculating, how old would Xi Jinping be then? Well, he'll be 82 years old in 2032. So it is conceivable. He set the goals for 2032. It is conceivable he'll still be around then. So anyway, because he's not going anywhere, and because I think many of the problems in the U.S.-China relationship, or they can be equally placed at his doorstep as at ours in Washington, I'm not very optimistic that there will be a real large improvement in the relationship.
Okay, well, with that, let's go to some of the questions from the audience. One is a sort of behind the scenes question. In your book, you really do get into the lives of the people that you talk to, and the question is how you gained the trust of these families. How did you get this behind the scenes look?
Well, you know this is certainly as well as I do, Bay, as a former journalist in China. I mean, first of all, people are extremely friendly, and the novelty factor of having a foreign journalist from far away come and start talking, in a village or wherever it is in China, is high enough that people tend to be very open, and in many cases, I think it may be starting to change, unfortunately, but in many cases would be very welcoming. In the case of the Mo's that I feature in my book, from the get-go, they were very open and willing to talk to me. Having said that, I kept in touch with them and went back and visited them on and off for a period of 20 years. And that no doubt went a long way towards sort of cementing that relationship that started way back in 2000.
And so when you meet people like the Mo's, do you see there being any possibility of them moving up in society? There's a question whether you would call the system in China a sort of caste system, where there's absolutely no mobility.
Yeah, so I wouldn't call it a caste system, but I think the reality of China, where there is, built into the structure of Chinese society and the economy, is this distinction between about half the people that are born or their parents are born in rural China and those people in the cities, and this affects their ability to get proper health care and good education for their children. I think this is something that is not really recognized to a large degree. And I think it is extremely important in understanding the future of China and the future of China's economy. As I mentioned earlier, the Chinese government has set this goal of trying to become a much more domestic reliant economy, much more reliant on the spending power of their own people, or boosting domestic consumption. Domestic consumption in China is still around 30% of GDP, which is very low, probably half of what it is, or close, close to half of what it is in terms of global averages. And one of the reasons that it's been so difficult for them to boost the spending power of its own people is because of this system, which in effect keeps about half the people as second-class citizens. So whereas I wouldn't call it a caste system like in India, I do think it is extremely important. I think it's very important to the future of China. I think it's deeply unfair. It's not only an economic issue, but certainly a human rights issue for China today.
So what steps would you say that China needs to take to improve the quality of life and opportunities for these rural Chinese? I mean, is that even a goal of China's government?
Yeah, so I mean, they've been, to the Chinese government's credit, I mean, as I said, just going back for more than 20 years, they've been focused on trying to deal with these gaps between urban and rural China, between the coast and the interior, between the people from the countryside and the cities. And they put a lot of money into it, actually. The infrastructure build out, they spent a lot of money on building these, expressways deep into the countryside. And it is striking, if you go to the province of Guizhou now, to see these expressways sort of in the middle of nowhere, going through the countryside. And it has had an economic impact to put those in. And they've put large amounts of money into trying to boost rural healthcare, lots of money into rural education. As I said, often the infrastructure of these rural boarding schools is very impressive. That's because the central government has mandated that a certain amount of money would be spent on improving rural education, and that typically goes into the infrastructure, the hard infrastructure, the buildings. But what they haven't done is deal with these very basic policies that I would argue are at the crux of actually breaking down this distinction between the countryside and the cities, which again is the household registration policy and also this dual land policy. And they've been talking for a long time about reforming those policies as well, but for a whole bunch of reasons, they've made very, very little progress.
What are some of those reasons?
Yeah, so well, the household registration policy, there's a number of different issues there. A big one is this perception, which may be fair, that the cost of integrating the migrant workers and their families so that they get the same level of education and healthcare will be exorbitant. And in the Chinese system, these social welfare costs typically are paid by the local governments. So there's been resistance from municipal governments, city governments around China who say, we don't have the money, or we don't want to spend the money to bring all these migrant children into the schools, for example. So that's one big issue. Another big issue is resistance from basically privileged urbanites, privileged people from the cities. And one of the things we've seen in recent years is actual protests by the parents of kids in the cities against these well-meaning efforts by the central government to bring more migrant worker kids into the urban schools. So you actually have these parents that are from the cities who basically, they actually went to the local Ministry of Education and protested and said, it's already hard enough for our kids to get into the good schools in the city. We don't bring in more kids from the countryside. So there's a real resistance, unfortunately, from urban people in China. And then the final one is a big one, which is, I think, this fear of instability and obsession with security amongst the leadership in the Communist Party of China. And going back for decades, there's been this, or maybe even longer than decades, there's been this widespread perception amongst the leaders of China that uncontrolled flow of people, they used to call it blind flow, is what they would, mangliao in Chinese, that this somehow was very risky for the future of the country. So for many, many years, they have tried to control where people go. And when they have tried to make steps to reform the hukou, or the household registration system in recent years, typically it's a top-down approach where they designate particular cities that they've decided could benefit from having these migrants move in. And those are the places where the migrants are supposed to go. But whether the migrants actually want to go there, whether there are jobs available there is, that's not usually a concern of the government.
So when you released your book, was there any impact in the provinces you were in and interviewing the migrant workers from these provinces?
No, they're not with the Mo's, not with the migrants, and actually nothing tied to the release of my book. In the course of writing my book, I interviewed people. I mentioned earlier the fact that Xi Jinping carried out a massive crackdown on the labor activist movement, starting around 2012, right after he ascended to the top of the leadership. Within about 2 years, almost that entire infrastructure of labor activism and these NGOs that had popped up to cater to the factory workers were all shut down. And some of the people that I interviewed in my book were the heads of these NGOs. And before I even wrote my book, a number of these people ended up in jail. And just an example of this very awful authoritarian approach that the leadership under Xi Jinping has taken to anything they see as potentially destabilizing of the regime. But that's not connected to my reporting or to the book.
Okay. So one question. So does capitalism in China require the availability of cheap labor? If there were a change in the status of migrant workers, would that actually affect capitalism in China?
Well, I would say that the economic miracle, if you will, that we've seen over the last 4 decades after reform and opening in China was in large part this sort of factory to the world model, creating creating the goods that were then exported to the world that we would then buy in Walmart or our iPhones or our iPads. That was sort of built on the premise of very, very low worker wages. And one of the reasons why China was able to maintain such low worker wages was because of the household registration policy. And basically a policy that kept the migrants as second-class citizens on their toes, very vulnerable in the cities, and made it very difficult for them to effectively bargain, for example, higher wages. So I think up until today, low-cost labor has been very important to Chinese capitalism, if you will. And I think it's been very important for China's broader economic success so far. The challenge that they're facing right now, as I said, is the move to a much more domestic consumption-driven economy. And if they're going to do that, they don't need cheap labor. They need everyone in China to sort of open up their wallets, if you will, and start spending more money. And this just has not happened in large part because of these policies. And also, you see very high savings rate, particularly amongst migrants and other people, and they simply just don't have much money to spend at this point.
Here's a question about how China has been acting regionally. So especially in the last 10 years, China's been flooding regional economic lightweights with aid and direct funding of infrastructure projects. In Cambodia, for example, it seems to be an attempt to win hearts and minds of Cambodian citizens. What is the long-term goal of these projects, do you think?
That's a big question. I would say that obviously we have the One Belt, One Road project, which is sort of the broader strategic project that China is pushing. I mean, clearly they're economic. In some cases, China is exporting capacity abroad. That's one part of it. But they clearly have a strategic element as well. And if you actually read the Chinese policies and the speeches by the leaders, when they talk about One Belt, One Road or the push abroad, they're very open about, in some cases, about the strategic element as well. So it is also, as the questioner phrased it, this hearts and minds thing, as well as as just economics. It will be interesting to see what happens going forward. As I'm sure you know, there's increasingly been pushback against some of these projects, issues of lack of transparency when these big investments come into places like Africa, issues with the fact that in many cases, they'll bring in for a big infrastructure project, they'll bring in a huge team of their own Chinese workers, and they won't create as many jobs in the local economies. So all these things, there's also the whole issue with the so-called debt trap diplomacy, the fact that in many cases, these governments have become in hoc to the Chinese government and not clear that they can find a way to pay them back, even as they have gotten these big infrastructure projects put into their countries.
Great. And the last question is actually from Terry Widener, who is the former director of the Mansfield Center, a China expert. In your book, you mentioned but don't focus on ghost cities. What are the prospects of the policy of moving people off the land to populate cities in the interior?
So it's interesting, again, as I mentioned just some minutes ago, when you look at their efforts to reform the hukou policy or the household registration policy, much of it is this top-down thing where they designate, they being the party, the central authorities in Beijing, which cities will actually open up to migrants. And what we've seen is, in many cases, there's this idea that a city is facing its own challenges. Maybe the economy is not so good. Maybe there's a ghost city there. There's a whole bunch of empty buildings, apartment buildings that constructed and no one ever bought them. And there's this idea somehow that might be a good place to have hukou reform, because we can then direct a lot of migrant workers into this city, and somehow they'll find jobs even though the economy is not doing well. And somehow they will buy these vacant apartments, even though they don't have jobs to earn the money to buy the apartments, all these unanswered questions. So I do think there is this idea that somehow the Chinese government, with this top-down approach, can deal with these other economic problems by channeling where the migrants go. I think it's deeply questionable that can actually work out that way. And as I said earlier, it really pays no attention to the most important question, which is, where do these people actually want to live? What we've seen so far in China is often the most vibrant, biggest cities where the most jobs potentially are the ones that have really cracked down. And in some cases like Beijing and Shanghai, these big cities, they've actually tried to drive out migrants, and they've actually set targets to reduce the populations in these cities. And so anyway, yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I do think that there's clearly been this connection made between figuring out what to do with the migrants and how they're going to deal with ghost cities. But I think I find it very difficult to think that this could work.
Thank you so much, Tiff. You've touched on so many interesting themes that are crucial to looking at the future of China and the CCP, and how the U.S. relationship with China will look in the future. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Dina Mansour, and thanks again for this fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Bay.
Well, and I'd like to thank you both so much. I encourage you all to pick up a copy of Tiff's book. It is compelling reading, and it's critical for people in Montana to be more aware of what's going on in China as one of our critical trading partners. I also want to thank Bay so much. She has a fascinating background in journalism and broadcasting, specifically her work with Radio Free Asia. So I'm sorry we didn't get to hear more about that tonight. But thank you both for a fascinating discussion, and thank you so much to our viewers today. I encourage you to join us on December 2nd, where we will be featuring recently elected both Republican and Democratic legislators. We'll be identifying those shortly, so join us for that. And also very exciting news that you may have heard is that the 2021 Mansfield Lecture will feature Dr. Anthony Fauci. He will be joining us via Zoom because we wouldn't dare put him at risk at flying to Montana in the midst of a pandemic, nor would he probably agree to fly to Montana in the midst of a pandemic. But he will be speaking to Montanans on February 17th. So we hope you can join us for that. So with that, thanks again, Tiff and Bay. Thanks to all of you and good night.